Welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the Research Works podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you are able to join us for yet another wonderful episode of the Research Works podcast.
Yes, welcome back. There is a little bit of a speechy takeover happening here today. And we're so thrilled that we have managed to time this so well so that we could have another in-person recording with not one, but two special guests today.
Definitely a takeover.
So welcome Sam Calder and Elizabeth Hill.
Thanks, guys. Excited to be here.
Well, we are so excited to have you both here.
Yeah.
And as we said, not one but two experts in the topic that we are going to cover today. So before we get stuck into that, we'll briefly tell our listeners a little bit about our special guests.
Yes.
Dr. Sam Calder is a speech pathologist, clinical educator, lecturer and researcher from the Curtin School of Allied Health and the University of Tasmania. He's passionate about evidence-based practice and interventions in speech language pathology. Dr. Liz Hill is also a speech pathologist and lecturer at Curtin University, a mental health and child and family health researcher. Liz's research pursuits are to understand the ways communication and language disorders affect young people and develop better interventions and methods of clinical practice to deliver positive outcomes. And this is particularly for young people who are at higher risk of suffering from mental illness and lack of social participation. So that's the formal getting to know you bit.
And there's so much more to it, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. That's because we had two guests, so it had to be, as a kind of condensed version of our formal getting to know you, but the informal version is obviously our icebreaker.
Always exciting.
Today's question is, which of Snow White's 7 dwarfs best describes you? And I know it's really hard to remember who all 7 of them are. So we've got bashful, jock, dopey, grumpy, happy, sleepy or sneezy.
Oh, Lizzie, how about you go first?
Yeah, I'm probably going to do a bit of a cop-out and say more than one.
Yeah.
That's all right. It does depend on the day and also the time of day, I reckon.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with a mix of happy and sleepy and more recently a little sneezy, to be honest, in the current season. So I'll pick those 3.
Yeah. Love
That's
it.
a good one.
It's like a pick and mix.
Correct.
Sam, what about you?
Yeah, I was thinking probably a mix, but I'm probably just going to go with bashful. Just because I never thought I was bashful, but my wife likes to remind me that I'm bashful all the time. So in an endeavour to better know myself, I'm just going to go with that one.
Oh, that's a good one. That's
self-reflection.
Yeah,
I like it. Yeah.
It's a pretty good thing to do early in the morning. Start thinking about all of it. Look, I think this is a great question, Ash. You come up with the best ones. I would also actually say I'm a bit of everything, but I would say mine is, let's go with my food dependent stuff. So I'm grumpy if I haven't eaten for more than 4 hours. I'm happy once I've eaten, and I'm sleepy once I've eaten too much carbs. So let's do that around food, because I think that best describes me.
Yeah. Very happy with
Ash,
that.
what about you?
I feel like I am predominantly sneezy. In winter I'm sneezy because I feel like I've just been sick for the last 3 months. In spring I'm sneezy because I get really bad hay fever. I'm just sneezy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
happy as well, like not angry or grumpy about it, but
just embracing it. Yeah. Look, I actually remember when we first came up with the idea to start this, and we met at a cafe, and both you and I were like, really? Do you remember that? Yeah. We were both badly ridden with like bad hay fever, and we had like a really blocked nose.
Yes.
And we were sitting there going, if we start this podcast, we have to clear our nose.
We have to sort ourselves
we
out.
have to work this out. So, yeah, we both have hay
Get
fever.
some
So there we
speeches
go.
on board. Local hygiene. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's probably what we do
we
need
will
to
take
do.
some tips
Yeah,
after
yeah, that's a
the
good idea.
recording. Yeah, that's good.
All right, that was a great question, but let's get into this wonderful paper. So the aim of this study was to estimate the prevalence of children meeting the diagnostic criteria for developmental language disorder at age 10 years in an Australian population sample. Using the Raine Study data, the team were able to determine the percentage of children who met the contemporary diagnostic criteria at age 10. The team also aimed to identify potential risk factors and to assess the magnitude of the relationship between potential risk factors and the presence of developmental language disorder, or DLD, at 10 years. So this is the first study of Australian children estimating the prevalence of DLD, and one of a few that identify the proportion of children with a clinically significant language deficit in middle childhood.
Thank you, Dana.
Very
Beautiful
welcome.
summary.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sam and Liz, let's start broadly. And could you tell us, by way of explanation, what developmental language disorder is? Because I imagine, it's not something that our listeners might be familiar with. So
Sure. And if your listeners could walk away with nothing else but knowing what DLD is, that would be an absolute win for us.
So cool.
Great.
Yep, yep.
So kind of our mission in life is that we don't have to provide a lay explanation for what DLD is. People talk about DLD as if it is, similar to autism or
Sure.
ADHD or, even intellectual disability. So
sure.
Yep.
simply put, DLD is a childhood condition where children have difficulty learning and using language in the absence of another condition that may explain a language disorder, such as autism or intellectual disability. So it begins in early childhood, and it might present as if children have lower vocabularies, difficulty with grammar, difficulty understanding instructions, and it becomes particularly pronounced when kids enter schooling, because that's when, the real functional impact of the language tends to manifest.
Of course.
Yeah.
And do we have, this paper obviously, sought to determine the prevalence of DLD, but prior to that, what was kind of the understanding around prevalence?
Sure. So we've got two big studies in English-speaking countries. So one in the US that was published in the 90s when DLD was still referred to as specific language impairment, which we'll dive into a little bit later.
Yeah.
And one more recently in the UK, which was published in 2016. And both of those studies found that the prevalence of DLD or SLI was around 7% at 4 to 5 years. So that is equal to about 2 in every mainstream classroom of 30. So it's often been referred to as the most common hidden disability or the most common disability you've never heard of.
Yeah. Wow, that's
so
true.
interesting. And you just also touched on there that there might be other terms that have been used previously or perhaps currently to describe DLD. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So there's a long history of exploring disorder with language in childhood. The most common label for it prior to DLD was probably specific language impairment, or SLI, but it's also been referred to as language learning impairment, primary language impairment, and language learning difficulties, language learning disorders. So lots and lots of different terms. I think there was a recent consortium of experts that came together, and the aim was to reach consensus on the labels. And they had, over 30 that they'd found in the literature. So it was really important to, speak the same language.
Absolutely.
And so the key outcome of one of the key outcomes of that consortium was to come to terms and agree on a label, and they agreed on developmental language disorder.
Yeah, and it's. As you were explaining that, I was thinking a lot about developmental coordination disorder, because that's something that I have done a bit of work in previously, and same kind of problem. There was so many different ways that people were describing this disorder, and it loses the potency and your ability to advocate for, meaningful change for these kids when there isn't that awareness around the condition. So even just that kind of step seems really important to, find that common language and that common voice to try and advocate for change.
Yeah, and I think actually a lot of what was learned as part of the consortium came from the work that was done with DCD prior.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot of lessons learned, and the expert panel drew upon that.
So just a question on that then. So DLDs are really quite a new term. Like how long has it been around for? Is it since that consortium?
So 2017 was when the paper was published.
Right. Right.
But the paper itself went through a preprint process, so lots of people were giving their input.
Sure.
The actual panel is quite large.
I bet,
So people have been talking about DLD probably since around before that, but common language around 2016, 17 onwards.
Okay.
And for the most part, clinicians and researchers alike are quite happy with DLD and do a lot of advocacy around that. And the real aim is to make sure we're speaking the same language.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. No, that's great. So when will a child be diagnosed with DLD? Like when does that happen?
I really feel like I'm hogging it here, but Liz has got some other questions. Yeah. We did pre-prepare. It can be really tricky because there's so much variability in early development. I mean, we just know the 0 to 5 space, 0 to 3 even, is just, there's so much chaos. Sometimes it's, how do the little people make it through? But they do because they're resilient and robust. So it's really tricky to diagnose early, but the literature indicates around 4-ish clinicians can be relatively confident that the language difficulties will persist and it's unlikely these kids will recover and catch up to their peers spontaneously.
Yeah, okay. And the process of that, of getting diagnosed, like what does that look like?
Yeah, it's speech pathologists can diagnose DLD, on their own, but we tend to advocate for a multi or transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach. Wow,
it's a big word. A lot of syllables.
Yes, I am speechy. We're using a speech pathologist, educational or developmental psychologists, as well as pediatricians.
Okay.
Some cases we work with social workers.
Okay.
And definitely working alongside educators, so teachers and education assistants as well.
Sure.
Because they can provide that critical information around the functional impact of the language difficulties if those kids have reached formal schooling.
Okay. So I guess once they get to schooling, I think you've got multiple people involved that can, see the child in the context of other children and probably have a bit of an idea that there may be some potential delay there. But previous to that, you said around sort of 4 years, a lot of that time as parents, they might suspect possibly that there could be some delays. That sort of, and then, how does that sort of get going? Because I know that's quite a tricky process to know whether your child is behind or not.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Liz and I were actually just talking to some of our US colleagues last night, and it's just there's such vast differences across nations in terms of how to identify these kids. So lots of universal screening in the US and the UK. I think Australia is getting to that point.
Okay.
But clinically what I found is most of the kids came to me when they were flagged by the child health nurse. So the child health nurse would flag them around 2 years, using the MacArthur-Bates or the ages and stages questionnaires.
Right.
And then sort of note that the kids' vocabularies might not be as large as one would expect. Yeah. So keeping an eye on them, providing some strategies. And if the strategies didn't expedite that language growth, then we'd sort of refer on to a speech pathologist to have a more formal assessment process.
Yeah, that sounds fair. And is it a permanent condition? Like, if you can diagnose it this early, you've got the whole school and, what do we see towards, adulthood? Do we know?
Yeah. So short answer is yes, it is permanent. We consider DLD to be a lifelong condition. The caveat there being the developmental at the start of language disorder.
Sure.
So, we know that some kids will grow out of DLD and they will potentially catch up to their peers, and that's great. But for the most part, most of these kids will grow up with a language disorder and end up with a language disorder in adulthood and never quite catch up to people their own age, and experience ongoing functional difficulties as well.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
So, obviously with the caveat that every child is different and probably presents quite differently, what are some of the common, I suppose, clinical features of DLD?
Yeah, so again, DLDs, we often refer to it as one of the most heterogeneous clinical populations.
Yeah.
So no one child with DLD is the same.
Yeah.
But typically, DLD might early on present as children failing to meet the communication milestones. So they might be late to talk, they might have reduced vocabulary, speak in short sentences, and speak ungrammatically, so leaving off those markers on the ends of words. So I just kicked the ball instead of I just kicked the ball.
Okay.
Really, non-specific vocabulary, lots of, I want that there and this one over there.
Okay.
And as they approach formal schooling, it might be more obvious that they can't understand instructions or routines. They might have difficulty recounting events or telling stories or even just communicating their wants and needs. And ultimately difficulties with reading and writing, and as well as establishing and maintaining friendships too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I imagine there's quite
multifaceted.
an emotional and behavioural component to it as well. Is that?
Yes, and do you want this one?
Sure. I think because clinically I worked with quite a few adolescents with DLD who weren't diagnosed until they were quite in late childhood or even adolescence.
Right.
And so by that time, because we know that language and communication underpins everything and emotion regulation and behaviour, your ability to identify and explain why you feel a certain way and how to manage that. You know, particularly for older kids, we can start to see that impacting on engagement in the classroom, their conduct. They can become the naughty kids in the classroom or the disengaged children or students.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, it becomes a bit harder to identify what the underlying problem is, that it might be language and communication and understanding or expression of language. And so I think it's really important for us to wave the flag that, of course, early identification is key for those young kids, but still, you know, being aware that for older kids, just because it might not be so obviously linguistic or obvious to do with language doesn't mean that DLD doesn't exist for these older children.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, often we working alongside middle school age children and their teachers, they just don't even think about language because they assume it's there.
Yeah.
They assume they've got the language, so it must be something else. But actually, if we look back at the root cause here, it can all be traced to difficulties with language.
Yeah. And just a final thing there before we get more into the study itself, because I'm very curious.
Yeah.
You know, we're sort of saying DLD, you would have that in the absence of another diagnosis, like cerebral palsy, for example. But I imagine given the population or children that do have cerebral palsy, you may have DLD that sort of comes on top of that, or do we treat it separately?
So I've definitely worked with kids that have cerebral palsy and DLD.
Sure.
So it's really the exclusionary nature of the diagnosis. It was part of the Catalyzed Consortium was to minimise that because it was very exclusionary before. So we talk about lots of co-occurring difficulties. It just gets harder to tease apart with things like autism, where we know there's inherent language difficulties associated with that and the neurodiversity, and as well as intellectual disability. So it's really hard to tease that apart as well. But children with low average IQ can very certainly meet diagnostic criteria for DLD, and children with cerebral palsy, ADHD, dyslexia, lots of co-occurring conditions. And we see actually lots of co-occurring difficulties.
Okay. Yeah.
And I guess because of that, you know, obviously being able to diagnose the underlying difficulties is incredibly important for funding and for the nature of the ongoing treatment. But we also do want to emphasise that we really highlight the functional impact, kind of irrespective of the underlying cause. So whether it's DLD or language disorder, associated with X, we really want to be looking at how that impacts that child functionally and directing services that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other important components of the study we're talking about is the link to the Raine Study here in Western Australia. And, you know, in WA here, we are very familiar with the Raine Study and what it involves. But perhaps for our listeners who aren't from here, you could explain a little bit about the Raine Study and some of the features and why it's such a unique part of WA.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that Sam and I are relatively new to working with the Raine data, and it's such an exciting experience because we are really lucky here in WA to have such an incredible resource. So the Raine study began in 1989 as a pregnancy or prospective pregnancy cohort study, which basically means that they followed a whole bunch of people for a long time. And it initially began to look at the effect of ultrasound on fetus development and at King Edward Memorial Hospital here in Perth. So the Raine Foundation received funding to recruit up to almost 3,000 pregnant women and follow their babies over time. And what's so unique about, well, there are a whole bunch of things that are unique. I could go on about this for ages, but I know we have time limits, that it's representative of the general population. So we know there was a low selection bias with this group of pregnant mothers and their children. So we can be fairly confident that whatever comes out of that Raine data is representative of the general WA population.
Amazing.
And the other unique feature of it is its sample size, the fact that we've still got almost 3,000 families involved in it, and that it's still going. So, you know, we when we talk about the Raine data, we talk about generations. So generation 1 is the mother. Generation 2, their children, and the generation 3 follow-ups are starting next year. So they're the babies of the original Raine Study babies. And, you know, it's absolutely incredible the number of variables or the kinds of information that are held in the Raine data. So we're talking any number of biological and medical variables or information, as well as parent-reported environmental factors about the child and their family environment, academic outcomes for these kids throughout their schooling, employment outcomes, income, hospitalisations. It's just such a rich data set, which really allows researchers and the public to benefit from that, and looking at the origin and the impact of a whole range of different diseases, disorders, delays. So it really is such a unique opportunity to understand these conditions in more detail.
Yeah.
Gosh, the foresight, hey, to set that up.
I know.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
And the engagement to have these families continue with this study for such a long period of time, like to be up to the 3rd generation of involvement. It's just incredible.
Every year, the Raine Foundation do a research symposium at UWA one of my favourite things about going to that event is that there are Gen 1 mothers who come along and the Gen 2 babies and they give their personal anecdotes about being involved in the study, and you know their tagline is kind of any one of us could change your life, and really meeting them and hearing their stories it's amazing, and they've really created a wonderful community that's as part of the research as well. Yeah,
it's beautiful.
What amazing research. So out of the Raine study then we've got what we're about to talk about. So can you just talk us through what the aim of this particular paper is?
Yeah, so the aim of the paper was to provide the first estimate of the number of children meeting contemporary diagnostic criteria for DLD in a representative population sample in Australia. And we also want to evaluate the predictive power of proposed and conceptually relevant risk factors for DLD as well.
Exciting. Yeah. There we go.
I mean,
big aim.
But we also thought, you know, working with the Raine data set, we could address the question. It's a relatively, we say it's simple, but, you know, as researchers, we know it's probably as simple as it gets, you know, looking at numbers, raw numbers. So we were very excited about that.
Yeah, of course. And so could you describe the participants that were included in your study?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, we have almost 3,000 families involved in that initial generation of the Raine cohort. And because we clearly wanted to look at language outcomes, we needed to find those children for whom there was language data available. So the majority, and Sam will touch on this in a second, but the majority of the information that we used was collected when the Gen 2 babies were 10. And so out of those almost 3,000 families, we had 1,600, around about 1,600 that there was language data for.
Amazing.
And those kids, you know, were predominantly from English-speaking families. They were predominantly Caucasian families. And, you know, there are obvious caveats there for need for ongoing research to looking at, you know, a more diverse range of children. But I will mention that at the time, that was representative of the WA population. So we know that that's the case. That's generally the participants that were included.
Yeah.
And I will speak to the more specific measures we use to define the clinical population.
Yeah.
So the key language measure we use is a tool called the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals. It was, we call it the SELF for short.
Great.
And it was in its third edition then, and it's now in its fifth edition, but it is a widely known and widely used standardized assessment.
Yep.
And it's used clinically and in research, and it provides a really broad picture of a child's language or the child's language skills across a range of areas. So it looks at their understanding of language as well as their use of language and across the different domains of language. So it looks at their grammar, their vocabulary, their ability to follow instructions as well.
Okay.
So it's a really useful tool, and it gives us an aggregate score of their language functioning. So that's kind of what we use, is that aggregate score of their language functioning. And any child that was performing 1.5 standard deviations below the population mean, so the Raine population mean, we considered would meet criteria for DLD.
Okay.
Alongside that, we looked at the Raven's coloured progressive matrices as a measure of nonverbal IQ.
Okay.
And this was just to sort of capture those kids that would potentially meet criteria for intellectual disability.
Sure.
And so we would define those children as having a language disorder associated with intellectual disability.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the reason it's important to look at nonverbal IQ is because that's a key outcome of the catalyzed consortium. So specific language impairment used to have a cutoff, used cognitive referencing. So if a child performed below 85 on a nonverbal IQ, they were considered to be low average and then not meet criteria for DLD.
Sure.
But what we know from the evidence is that this cutoff is quite meaningless, because children who have low average nonverbal IQ and difficulties with language respond equally as well to interventions, and there's no difference in the functional impact associated with that.
Okay.
So that's why that exclusionary criteria was actually removed from the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah.
And I love how, just going back as you're describing that, I love how this is a sequence of events that have occurred, and you talk about this being the contemporary, prevalence. And so you've taken the definition of DLD, the consortium, what was said by that, the Raine study, you've got these great outcome measures. There's just a lot of confidence in the results, which we're about to talk about. But I love that it is contemporary. It's because otherwise, like you said, there's so many other terms that could be used out there. We're just really bringing it right back. This is what it is. And it's huge. It's so great. Yeah. So now the exciting part then. So the results, can you talk us through what you guys found?
Yeah, sure. Can I just take a step back with the diagnostic criteria as well? I just really want to quickly highlight that we weren't able to measure functional impact, which is a diagnostic criterion. And we weren't able to evaluate early onset, because what actually we found is that there was a sort of a flip in the cohort. So those with early language or language data didn't have late language data, and those with late language data didn't have early language data. So that was and we do highlight that in the paper, that it's a limitation. But we just want to address that. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, isn't it? I mean, you have all this data that has been done, and it was done previously, and you're using that. But we know that, when you would assess someone, you would actually look at it from that perspective as well. So it's always worthwhile knowing the strengths and limitations. Yeah, sure. All right. Well, do you want to get into some of the results then in terms of the prevalence?
Sure. So we found that it was 6.4% of children that present with DLD at middle childhood, so at 10 years. So that's pretty on the money with the previous research looking at around 7%. So that sort of indicated to us that, yes, DLD is persistent and it's prevalent and it's likely to continue on into adolescence and likely adulthood as well. Yeah. We also looked at defining sort of subcategories of DLD, looking at expressive language deficits. So of that 6.4%, 33.7% had expressive language deficits. So that's a marked difference in the ability to express their wants and needs, maybe have some overt grammatical difficulties, low vocabulary compared to their understanding of language. Okay. 20.2% had receptive language deficits, so there's a marked difference in understanding language, so potentially following directions, understanding concepts compared to their production. But the majority, 46 0.2% was a combined profile of expressive and receptive. And again, that's consistent with the literature too. So we see that most kids with DLD tend to have mixed receptive and expressive difficulties. And I want to highlight here as well that there's some literature that sort of indicates that the expressive-receptive dichotomy is not terribly useful. Because it's really hard to tease apart the reciprocal nature of language difficulties. So, if you have a difficulty understanding language, it's likely to have a flow-on effect to your producing language as well. But I do want to note that, we know from the literature, and I've certainly seen it clinically, that those children that have pronounced receptive language difficulty tend to be more at risk of flying under the radar because they can talk the talk but not necessarily walk the walk. And these kids as well, we know, are prognostically less likely to catch up to their peers and make gains with intervention as well. So we do want to highlight those kids that have receptive-only difficulties, but also noting that mixed receptive-expressive profile, those children are going to have difficulty understanding language as well as using it.
So it's worthwhile digging deeper and having a better understanding. Can I ask, it's a little bit, I guess, so out of the 6.4%, and that was the percentage, like half of those kids had a combined receptive and expressive. What do the other half look like? Like, because when you're just sort of describing DLD, do we have much data on what that looks like?
Yeah, so are you asking what does expressive only look like, or
just the other? Because there's a combined. What would that look like on its own? Because I guess that's the part where I kind of go, what would I see in a child?
Great. And I love that question. And it makes me think back to, I've been practicing for about 3 years, and my wife had said to me, I actually don't know what a child with DLD looks like. And you've never told me that before. So it made me really think I need to be good at describing this. So the kids with expressive only difficulties, they tend to be the ones that teachers talk to us about. I know they're bright. I know they can understand things. I know that they know what's going on. There's something about the way that they, go about a task or they communicate. And they might speak in shorter sentences, really non-specific vocabulary. They might be really ungrammatical. And then that has a tendency to have a flow-on effect to their literacy as well. So difficulty with writing.
So it's not just a matter, like, would it be easy to kind of label these kids as being a bit shy? And if that expressive language isn't there, then they're just shy, they're not kind of forthcoming with information and it's harder to pick up that way.
And working with families, these tend to be the families that say, I know that, that's just them. They're just going to catch up. It's fine. It's okay. And it's really hard to have those conversations and say, I understand. And that makes your little one, and that's really important. But we also know that language is a really important foundational skill for success at school,
like friendships
and socialization, communicating wants and needs. Having those discussions to know when to access support can be challenging.
And from what you've said as well, there's also that flow on into kind of written language and other domains where that personality component or the shyness for if we're talking about the label, isn't potentially so much of a barrier. So it's kind of looking at that whole picture. And
absolutely.
Comes back down to what you're saying, Lizzie, it's that functional impact, I suppose, isn't it? And those observations are actually really powerful from all the people in different contexts, I suppose, because I can imagine at home when it comes to expressive, maybe, parents know how to read their children so well and they may just kind of go, I know what they want anyway. And then they go to school and people might not be able to do that for them and it might be more highted.
Exactly right. And I think, like Sam said, particularly this expressive only, I'm bunny earsing.
It's a lot of bunny ears.
Profile is sort of fairly unique, I would say, in a way to DLD. In other diagnoses that we see in kids and adolescents, things like ASD or ADHD, we would fairly typically see some sort of mixed difficulty in both understanding and using language, or and predominantly in understanding language. But this, having age expected or quite strong underlying language reception or understanding skills, but then impaired expression is relatively unique to DLD. So just being really aware that these kids can vary in the way that they use and understand language and knowing what that can look like.
let's talk about some of the risk factors then, and what they are and what you kind of found in this paper in terms of risk factors for DLD.
We were really careful about which risk factors we wanted to explore and select. So we selected ones that have a pretty solid foundation in the literature. So, low SES, maternal education, those who speak another language other than English, preterm birth. And then we wanted to look at some others that are conceptually relevant and having an emerging evidence base there.
Sure.
So there's some really interesting work coming out looking at dyadic parentees, so that, having children exposed to two speakers in their environment when they're learning language and developing as little people. Looking at early literacy environments, so being read to, and daycare attendance as well. So there's some interesting work around, actually, is daycare a good thing or a not so good thing for development, and especially around communication? And there's, two sides of the same coin there. So we were interested in looking at that as well.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. So in terms of what you found for the risk factors, let's perhaps talk about sex first of all. So what did you find there?
So there's a fairly stereotypical belief that males are at greater risk of developmental language disorder than girls, and we see in other populations as well. ASD instantly comes to mind. In so much so that being male is identified as a risk factor, in something like the DSM or other diagnostic manuals that we see used by other disciplines to identify DLD. But what we found is that, we went in perhaps with that expectation, and what we found was that there was actually an equal sex distribution for DLD. That's so just as many girls met the criteria as boys, which has a few implications, which we can get to, but something that we think is really important to come out and speaks to, and if I'll share a story, if that's okay, that I told Sam a couple of days ago when I was teaching some of the Masters of Psychology students at Curtin about this study and about DLD and implications for their practice as mental health practitioners. They were, one student in particular just looked really shocked, and I just went over and said, are you okay, basically? And he had shared that he worked in a school, and he's always thought that language disorder was pretty much only seen in boys. And when we were talking about the manifestation and the way that, you can identify a child with or a student with DLD, he was thinking, oh my goodness, I've seen girls like this in the schools, but I've always been taught that if I see a boy like that or a boy that's struggling, that's who I refer and that's who I highlight, and the girls are just being quiet or shy, or there might be something else going on. And he was having this really deep reflection in his own practice about how he might have played a part, not in any fault, but as part of that general systemic belief that boys meet criteria more frequently.
Gosh, that's actually really powerful, isn't it? Because I think we do think that there's always just that slightly higher prevalence, isn't there? And that gets spoken a lot, and you hear a lot of that in language that we that just is really prevalent in the community. But I guess that just highlights that if you see risk factors, regardless of sex, refer and get support, because otherwise those poor girls won't get any help for much longer, and we just don't think that's the problem.
And really obviously the value of awareness raising exercises is so now that we have this information, getting it out there and having it in the right place at the right time for the right people is really important.
So important.
And so the preterm risk factor, what did you find?
So we found that was a greater proportion of bubs that were preterm in the DLD group, but when we put that into a model to test its predictive power, it didn't predict later DLD. So equivalently, there was a greater proportion, but it didn't account for a bit of jargon, the unique variance in that diagnostic criteria. So we couldn't sort of identify that as a predictor later on. But we do want to highlight that we know that. Well, more recently, we've found that children that are born preterm have language difficulties in the early years. So we always want to flag that providing a rich language language learning environment for these bubs is really critical.
And one of the other ones that came out was exposure to smoke in utero. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we found that there was the odds were 2.56 greater when mothers smoked at 18 weeks gestation. So that was our only significant risk factor we found.
Wow.
It's really difficult to draw a causal link between smoking and later neurodevelopmental difficulties.
Sure.
I don't think anyone's going to fund that experiment.
No.
So previous research has also found that smoking is a risk factor. So in the late 90s in the US, they found that. But once the researchers had controlled for parental education, the predictive power was sort of washed out of that. So their conclusion was that actually smoking may be more of an indicator of environmental disadvantage rather than a causal perinatal risk factor.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah. And the other two that of note were having a father who didn't live at home. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And is that the you had a really nice term that you used before?
Parenting.
Thank you. Yeah. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah. That was why we selected that variable.
Yeah.
Just the way the data had been set up, there was no mother who didn't live at home. It was just father. So we looked at that one, and we were really quite surprised at that. And because we first ran our test to look at the distributions between the groups, and we thought, oh wow, this could actually be something really powerful that we could explore in greater detail. But then, like I said, when we put it into the model, it didn't predict the outcome later on. Yeah. But we always want to encourage the strengths of child rearing environments and knowing that, if you've got a single parent, absolutely anything is possible. It's just being mindful that perhaps, verbalizing your thoughts when you're around your little one could be a great way to just encourage that rich linguistic environment, potentially in the absence of having another grown up to communicate with.
Yes, sure. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it, in terms of conversations that happen naturally when there are more people around, that does happen. I mean, I think we all sort of can picture a family that's got like lots of kids and everyone's just chatting. Like there's just a lot of conversation that happens. And it's quite different when there's less people. So
and when you're in the thick of it and you're dealing with a little one, often just the last thing on your mind is to verbalize what you're doing right now. Let's actually just let's get this thing done. Let's get this nappy changed or get you fed. So,
okay, no, that's really good.
Yeah. And the other one was being read to less than once a week at 3 years of age. Is that right?
Yeah. So we kind of found
that. So interesting.
Yeah. At the 2-year mark, there wasn't a difference, but at the 3-year mark, there was. And we sort of thought that, this is indicative of that early literacy environment being read to. And actually, when we put it into the model, it was right on the cutoff for significance. So we couldn't say it was, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on, knowing that those children who are read to at least once per week at 3 years, that might form a protective factor against later language difficulties.
That's really interesting because anecdotally you hear a lot about, you have to read to your baby, and it's, it's really important that you're reading to your baby as much as possible, and that message kind of gets diluted as kids get older, but actually it seems like it's just as important, if not more important, as they get older, that you maintain that behaviour. Yeah,
absolutely. But it boils down to the same message, about having, we know if babies, even as soon as they are born, their brains are ready to learn language. And so surrounding them by, like Sam said, this rich, really robust language environment, however that occurs and with whoever that occurs is really important.
Yeah. It comes down to, our favourite term. I always talk to parents about this. Like, my two favourite words are environmental enrichment.
Yes.
And, it's so relevant in so many contexts of learning any new skills. But if we can think about what that looks like for a child in terms of their development, if we can make it really rich for them. And I guess that relates to, the main finding you found with regards to the smoking and the environment, that thinks more broadly about environment. I guess what are some of the things that we can take from that with regards to, more public awareness about, some of the factors? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, there's so much advocacy and public awareness around the risks associated with tobacco use. So I think this just adds another nail in the coffin to really, encourage people, and especially mothers who are expecting, to avoid using cigarettes while they're pregnant. But again, there's so much out there with that.
Like a lot of all behaviour, babies are primed and innately, ready to learn language most of the time or in the majority, but they really are influenced by their environment. So we need to be, as caregivers, as a community, surrounding that child, providing them the best possible opportunity and a really nurturing, rich environment to thrive.
Yeah. And you did say earlier that, this is a lifelong condition. So this what we do now in their childhood will have an impact on them across their lifespan. So,
and it needs to continue.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So I guess in terms of looking at adulthood, what does that look like? If we're trying to support people through that and by the time they're an adult, do you have any advice on that?
Certainly. So it's really interesting that at the moment there are, in the research, there seems to be a growing attention being paid to older adolescents and adults who have a history of DLD or who have language disorder. And one of the key things that this research is looking at comes down to awareness. So building the awareness so building the awareness of, say, employers and the community around the fact that there are adults who have language disorder, but then also really boosting the skills of those older adolescents and adults who have language disorder to be advocates for themselves and really aware of the supports that they need in the workplace, in their post-secondary environment, whether that's TAFE or university or straight into work, really boosting their resilience and self-efficacy to advocate.
It's important.
So where to from here? This is, we've covered a lot of ground with this paper, but I know that you're both incredibly busy, active researchers. So where does this work take you next?
Sure. So we know there's a scarcity of epidemiological research looking at functional impact. So lots of robust studies have followed up with adolescents and adults, and they've shown reduced academic outcomes and reduced employment opportunities, income and general well-being. So that's kind of where we're heading with that, and I'll let Liz speak to that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes back, and obviously very good at your jobs and your roles. A segue into what you were just saying is, when we have a really good understanding of what the functional impact looks like for these kids as they grow older, we can boost awareness around what that looks like for them, also give them the skills, like I mentioned, to advocate for themselves in different environments, but also being able to modify if necessary or accommodate for those language and communication difficulties in a range of different environments. And we're also really interested in working with bigger data sets and also one day, hopefully, starting our own prospective, cohort.
That's wonderful.
To look at what are those, we call them risk and protective factors or modifiable factors that we can, what mitigates the risk of going on to have poor mental health outcomes or reduced employment outcomes? How can we protect these individuals? We're
so
really interested in that.
Yeah. And it sounds like, a lot of what you're doing, there's a huge knowledge translation component to it now. You have a lot of information. It's just getting it out there in the right way for the right people.
Absolutely. And I will mention that one thing that Sam and I are really keen to do is work alongside people with lived experience of DLD, both individuals themselves and also parents, caregivers, educators to help guide that research. So it's certainly the lived experience voices at the centre of what we want to do.
Yeah, that's great.
That's a beautiful note to end on, I think.
I think it is. Wow. Well, we're not quite finished yet, actually. All right. Well, as you all know, we're about to head into our next segment, which is called Tell It to Ed. Now, Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening. He's been pushing faders, I'll put it the right way now, sliding things up and down, making sure we've got things coming through. But he has been listening, so I'm really curious to see what he's taken from this. So, Lizzie and Sam, I'll get you guys to give us a bit of a 60-second wrap-up to someone who doesn't have a background in this area, and Ed, in turn, will have time for a question. Take it away.
So we're going to split it in half. I'll do the first 30 seconds and Lizzie's got seconds.
I love it.
So we provided the first estimate of prevalence of DLD in a representative sample of Australian children in middle childhood using contemporary diagnostic criteria. 6.4% of children met criteria, which equates to 2 in every classroom of 30. This rate matches prevalence rates in early childhood, suggesting that DLD is stable and persistent. Despite more males with DLD being referred for clinical services, there were no differences in the rates of DLD between males and females, indicating potential referral bias. And smoking while pregnant was the only significant predictor of DLD at 10 years.
And this is really important because you want to raise awareness of the fact that this is a prevalent and often hidden condition that affects boys just as much as it affects girls. We want to understand why that's the case. That's certainly an area we want to look at more. And we want to raise awareness amongst parents, caregivers and educators about how we can identify these children and give them the targeted support that they need.
Oh, that was so good.
The divide and conquer approach.
I love that. Yeah, came in under 60 seconds. All right, Ed, over to you.
Oh, I have to admit, I followed this really well, so I'm pretty proud. I think I'm getting to a point where I'm following a little quicker than I used to back in the day.
In the day.
And I'm not sure how much more I can add to this conversation because it's been brilliant. Obviously, we have a full studio today. But this is one of these crazy Ed kind of thoughts.
Oh, gosh.
So my thought is obviously a language disorder is about speaking. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the flip side for that for me is sound and audio and processing that sort of stuff. I remember many, many years ago, there was like this internet sensation of this sound, the Yanni and the Laurel, where people could hear one or the other based on how either damaged their hearing is or how developed it is. So my question is there any link between, say, the development of like the oral capacity of children and whether, they can hear those particular registers well or not? And you touched on, I just wrote this down, dyadic parenting. So to me, in the crazy Ed theory, the male adds a little bit of that low-end frequency stuff that maybe doesn't balance out with the high frequency. Crazy thoughts, but is there any kind of link to that or is there any kind of information that kind of checks through children's hearing or young adults' hearing over that time?
Great question. Absolutely love it. And it's so, because you just delved into our brains then. So when we found that father not living at home, that was the first thing we thought of, was, it's the frequency at which children are hearing the sounds. Something's missing from that and they're not establishing the representations. But we couldn't find any predictive power, but it's definitely something we want to explore. So we are chatting to our audiology friends at Curtin and at Raine and Telethon Kids. But what I can say is that children that have sensory neural hearing loss, so damaged nerves basically and the ability to hear, will likely go on and have difficulties learning language.
Okay.
What we know is that children that have recurrent ear infections early on in their childhood may be a little bit behind early on, but do catch up to their peers. And the other thing I want to stress is that there's a really unique and exciting body of research that's looking at DLD in deaf children. So these children actually have difficulty using the morphology of sign language. So their difficulties in signing mirrors what we see in spoken language, which kind of suggests that it's not necessarily an auditory processing difficulty. It's probably more how we are mapping that information, whether it's auditory or it's visual, in our language centers in our brain and able to use it productively.
Yeah, gosh.
And I think I just want to commend you, Ed, on your knowledge of language development theory. Because I think it's just, as a much broader context, you're absolutely bang on that, language, really early language development begins with the infants tuning into the sounds around them and being able to discern environmental noise from speech sounds and what the characteristics of those sounds are, and then using that to develop their own language. So as a broader context, I think you've done an amazing job.
And I want to stress as well.
Just an IT professional.
And hearing is critical. And that's one thing that we always recommend. And we say, have you had hearing tested? But we know that from this work around children who are deaf with DLD as well, it's something beyond just hearing the sounds.
I think I'm just pulling from like my childhood. I think I've shared on the podcast that I have like a degree of perfect pitch. And a lot of the thought in the whole perfect pitch kind of community is that you learn those things from such an early age and you can miss it. So I guess I've asked this question before, like can you miss the key building blocks for language really early on?
You got in a second question.
I'm sneaking them in.
Short answer is yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Gosh. Well, that's was really insightful. As you were asking that question, just to all our listeners, we're all kind of like, whoa, and signaling to each other. Like, that's a good question.
He's done it again.
We're not going to be able to get his head out of this studio at this rate. Oh, look, that was such a great conversation. Ash, I reckon we've learned a lot from that one. That was so
I'm buzzing. I'm so excited.
Same. I feel like I can't quite keep my hands still.
I love learning new things.
This is great.
Yeah.
I absolutely loved it. And that's so reflective of the fact that you guys have such great knowledge and, you know, clearly you guys are great teachers as well, because you explain things so beautifully. Yep. So thank you so very much for being on the show, guys. Thank you.
So thanks. Like I said at the beginning, the opportunity is amazing. And what you do to translate research into the community and to other researchers is phenomenal. So thank you.
And we will throw out a little plug for DLD Awareness Day on the 14th of October. So watch out for purple and gold wherever you are in Perth. Look out for the stadium.
Okay.
Yeah. City West, Madagarra Bridge, they're all lining up.
Oh, that's so exciting.
That is very
and a huge part of that
too.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And a huge part of that awareness piece that we were talking about.
Yeah,
so yes.
Absolutely. Oh,
beautiful.
That's so
very
wonderful.
timely.
Well, to all of our listeners, remember you can have a look at all of our run sheet notes on our website and researchworks.net, and there's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well to keep part of a record of your PD. We know that our APRA registrations are coming up soon, so it's probably a really good thing to make sure you've got your record ready.
Yeah.
But for now, we say thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our guests once again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.